Hey, I'm Sam, welcome to Brickwall Pictures, and welcome back to this year's Macabre Month of Horror, where I'm diving deep into the filmographies of some of the masters of horror. Today I'm doing George A. Romero, the man best known for essentially creating the zombie genre as we know it today. I have all of his movies here, except for one that he disowned. It's not a horror movie, it's called There's Always Vanilla. And he hates that movie, and he won't talk about it. He's disowned it, so I'm not going to cover that one. But we have every other movie that he ever made in this ranking right here, every other feature film, I should say. We're going to get started here with Night of the Living Dead. This is Romero's most famous movie. It's also one of the most famous movies of all time. Night of the Living Dead changed filmmaking, I think it's fair to say. It changed indie filmmaking in particular. This movie was made completely outside the studio system at a time where that was an extreme rarity. It's not like today where indie films can, get made on the regular. He made this extremely cheaply, mostly with non-professional film people. I definitely recommend looking into behind the scenes of Night of the Living Dead because it's fascinating. There are several documentaries about it. There's a chance that you might only be familiar with George A. Romero from his zombie movies because those are definitely the ones that hit the biggest. Night of the Living Dead I don't think is his best zombie movie. I also don't think it's his second best zombie movie. I actually think it's his third best zombie movie. Just to give you a little foreshadowing as to where it ranks amongst the full series. It is excellent. It's extremely influential. It's dated, sure, and it's low budget to show in places, but it is effectively haunting. If you watch this in the right mindset, you kind of have to go back to the times a little bit. It's pretty tame by zombie movie standards, meaning there's not a lot of gore and whatnot, but for the times it was absolutely shocking. Especially shots where there's you can see them eating the bones and you look into behind the scenes, it's just stuff they got from a butcher shop, but it looks pretty gruesome, even still with the low budget and the fact that they're just using chocolate syrup as the black and white blood and stuff. The social commentary is, I would say, in its infancy. George A. Romero really is one of the best filmmakers at social commentary, I think, and I'm not even just saying in the horror genre. I think full stop, he's one of the best filmmakers when it comes to weaving compelling social commentary into his movies. Night of the Living Dead has social commentary, to be sure. Some of it is even accidental, but I don't think it being accidental hurts its power, the power that it has. The ending is phenomenal. It's an ending that is iconic and often imitated, I would say. Romero even kind of imitates it himself at times in his filmography, the Crazies ends almost the exact same way. Get Out, I think, was originally, in the original script, ended with a Night of the Living Dead ending, which makes sense for that movie. And then they changed it to a fake out where you think it's going that way and then something different happens. Often imitated. Great ending. Great editing, I would say, especially when it gets a little more surreal. It doesn't do that a lot, but there's the sequence that stands out the most for its editing is the basement where the little girl is stabbing her mother. It gets hypnotic almost, and the way that the sound distorts, that's pretty chilling. Even still, even as it can be a little corny in other areas. Some of the acting's not great. Dwayne Jones in the main role, he's good. He is solid. The rest of the cast is less solid. The zombies are good. The very first on-screen zombie, it's interesting to look back and realize that he moves way faster than most of the other shambling zombies. And then you can find out that Romero said, no zombie will ever move faster than that guy. He is the fastest a zombie should ever move. And then of course the zombie genre, as it evolved over the years with 28 Days Later and whatnot, the fast zombie became popular. I could talk about his zombie movies all day, and I mean 24 hours straight. I could talk about his movies. So I'm probably gonna have to keep this moving along, otherwise I'll just never move past Night of the Living Dead. I think I'm going to give it a B. It's extremely influential. It's not my favorite of his movies. It is rough around the edges, yada yada. Moving on. I got to move on from his Dead movies, or I'll just talk about them forever. Okay, next up is The Dark Half. This movie is a Stephen King adaptation, and Romero and Stephen King were friends in real life. They actually collaborated a number of times, not just on The Dark Half. Stephen King didn't really have much to do with this one. It's basically just an adaptation of one of his books. But Romero and King worked together on Creepshow, famously. And Stephen King is also in Knightriders. He's acting in that one. It's a small role. It's basically a cameo, and he is goofy as hell in Knightriders. But anyway, we'll get to that later. The Dark Half is an adaptation of a Stephen King book. It's very Stephen King-y, meaning it has all of his tropes and all of his typical fixations. Definitely not counted amongst the best Stephen King adaptations. Generally speaking, like if you look at lists of the best Stephen King adaptations, you're not likely to see The Dark Half on there. And I wouldn't call it one of the best King adaptations either. It's a little hokey, I think is the right word for it. It also has this kind of inescapable made-for-TV feel to it. Like it feels like a TV movie, even though I don't actually think it was. I think it was a theatrical release. And this story is just a little goofy, and they don't really sell you on it. Maybe Stephen King's book sells you on it more, but in the movie, you kind of just have to you need a lot of suspension of disbelief. It has low aspirations, but it accomplishes those aspirations. It reaches those goals. It's a good rainy afternoon kind of movie. I wouldn't say watch it on Halloween night or anything, if you know what I mean. It's okay for most of the runtime. Timothy Hutton is really good in the dual role, playing both halves, the normal half and the dark half. Also, Michael Rooker is in this in a pretty substantial role, and he's always good. Michael Rooker is always good. So the two of them kind of shoulder the movie. Romero has some fun with some colorful lighting. He's almost getting into some Creepshow territory with how colorful and flamboyant the lighting gets, and in a way that's absolutely not motivated, meaning there's no reason why these characters would be blasted with purple light in this scene, but hey, it looks nice, You can feel kind of like a Dario Argento influence. I think Romero and Argento were friends in real life too. They shared Goblin, the band. The band Goblin scored most of Argento's movies and also provided a bunch of music for Dawn of the Dead. And the way that Romero uses color, specifically in the Dark Half, feels a lot more like Suspiria or something out of Argento's playbook than his own playbook. And I would say the same about Creepshow. The Dark Half it's okay. It's not great, but I will say the ending is pretty goddamn good. It's ridiculous. The ending is so over the top. It's pretty stupid, but if you buy into it, it's a lot of fun. It really is ridiculous. It's so far over the top. I don't want to spoil it, really, but it's so crazy and so stupid that it becomes awesome that they just committed to it and went for it. And it's pretty well executed for how outlandish of a concept it is. The very final moments is what I'm talking about. It's not great, but it's okay. I don't think it's bad. I think it kind of gets a bad rap. I would give it, I would go C with it, honestly. It gets very poorly reviewed most places. I think it's pretty solid. It's not great, but it's okay. Okay, next up is The Crazies. The Crazies is another one that doesn't get super well reviewed. It was really low budget. It was made between Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead. And to me, it feels like a perfect half step between the two. It's you can see Romero stepping in the direction of Dawn of the Dead. It's not a zombie movie, but it does have a virus that, transmits from person to person. And it does have people turning into, violent, not quite creatures, because they stay human, but they get infected with this virus, and it's kind of depending on the person, the virus either just kills you or it turns you into a psychotic, violent, rage-filled person. Kind of like how they're technically infected with rage rather than a zombie virus in 28 Days Later. And also kind of like the recent The Sadness, which I reviewed, that movie that was made in Taiwan. Kind of like that, but much, much more reserved. Not as crazy violent and crazy gory as that movie. It's pretty tame as far as horror goes. It's interesting to see as the early stages of a pandemic, basically, but it's confined to one town, and it's about how the government tries to cordon off that area and contain it. I think it's really well done. Again, it gets not the best reputation, and I can see why. It is very rough around the edges, and it does have some pretty significant flaws when it comes to the writing. The characters are not great, and it's kind of across the board. None of the characters are very good. The scientists, military people, they're okay, but they're all pretty thin sketches. The main group of survivors, for a while, you don't really even know that they're the main characters, the good guys, because it's so scattershot, the focus of the movie. Once you realize, oh, these are the main characters, these are the survivors we're rooting for, they're not really that interesting, and you don't really care about them in particular. The acting isn't great, I wouldn't say. It's not distractingly bad or anything, but it's nothing great. That being said, I think it's a result of the movie taking a really large scope, which I think is admirable given its low budget, rather than focus on like one protagonist. There's like this whole group of people, and there's another group of people, and another group of people. And really what Romero's doing is it's kind of like these characters, none of them are that important, and it's really the situation that's important. Or at least that's when the movie excels, is when it's looking at the situation and how people en masse react to it, and how like the government would try to control the situation, how they would like think tank it and resort to like, are they going to just nuke the town? That stuff's really interesting. When it does go micro instead of macro and getting close on these characters, that's when it starts to fall apart a little bit, just because the characters are a little too thin and not performed super well. The Crazies is really good though. I like it a whole lot. I could go as high as A on my personal enjoyment, but I will say I think I have a little bias in there. It really hits my personal like sweet spot for what I'm looking for in this type of movie. And I would say as evidence of that, you can check out my first book, The Fall of Polite. It is very much in the same territory as The Crazies. If I'd seen The Crazies before writing this, it definitely would have been an inspiration. I actually only just watched it for this tier list, and I'm a big fan now. I kind of wish I watched it earlier, because I would have watched it several times by now. I liked it a lot. But just to cancel out my bias here, it's very much in my sweet spot. I would probably personally give it an A, but I think if we're talking like actual quality of the movie, you probably can't go above a B. And that's even with me like giving it a lot of leeway in its in the way that it's made and in the way that it presents its characters and whatnot. Anyway, check out my book if you feel so inclined. This is my post-apocalyptic revenge novel. This one's kind of like The Crazies, but my horror novel is South of the Mason-Dixon. This one's new, just recently published by Hellbound Books earlier this year. Check it out if you want to see my spin on the horror genre. Okay, next up is Bruiser. Bruiser is from the latter stages of George A. Romero's career, not in the like final stages. That would come later on. Bruiser is pretty forgotten. I don't think I've ever heard a single person talk about Bruiser. Actually, that almost goes for the dark half too. And Knightriders. Some of his movies just like really never get talked about. Same with Season of the Witch, I would say. He has a lot of movies that are kind of under the radar. If you've only known George A. Romero from his zombie movies, we'll allow this tier list to introduce you to what else he has to offer in his filmography and what is worthwhile. Because I think he's a great filmmaker, whether he's working in the zombie genre or not. Bruiser, however, is not one of his best movies. I would call it one of his weaker movies, actually. It's not talked about, and honestly, there's not really that much to talk about. It's just not that interesting. There's something to the premise, like it's basically trying to mine for fear, the common phobia of like masks, of like those like expressionless masks. The idea is it's actually Jason Fleming in the lead role, and he works in like a big business, and I forget the exact conduit for how this happens, but he ends up getting this mask attached to his face that's like stuck and he can't remove it. It's just like this white mask that's pretty devoid of features, and then that mask is like slowly taking him over. Peter Stormare is in it. He shows his dick, if that's of any interest to you. If you want to see Peter Stormare hang dong, this is the movie for you. That's memorable. That's honestly the most memorable part of the movie. He goes full like Brett Ratner mode, and he's like the boss flashing people, you know. Bruiser it's just not super memorable. It doesn't have a whole lot going for it. I don't think it's bad, but it is like extremely forgettable. I'm gonna put it in D. Again, it's not bad. It's not really like doing anything wrong. It's just not really doing anything right either. Next up is Martin. This is one of his early movies. This is Romero's spin on the vampire genre. He's always talked about for zombies, but he made a vampire movie too, and he made a pretty goddamn good vampire movie. Now, I call it a vampire movie because that is what it is, and that is what it bills itself as, and the main character does present himself as a vampire, but there's always this question of, is he really a vampire, or is this guy just insane? And that's both interesting and like there's something kind of brilliant to it. It's really worth exploring, and the movie does explore it very well to its credit. The performances are good, but really it's this question of, is this guy just a murderer who thinks he's a vampire? He's got these deluded fantasies, right? He doesn't have fangs that he bites into people's necks and drinks their blood with. He knocks them unconscious, and then he like slashes their wrist with a razor blade, and he just drinks it out of their veins. Anybody can do that. You don't have to be a vampire to do that, you know? So it's got some really interesting things going on. It's so well edited, and I would say that goes for most of Romero's movies. He usually edited his own movies, and he has such a particular editing style. I won't say he's like one of the best editors, but he is an editor where like, if you showed me a scene out of one of his movies that I'd never seen before, I would be able to pick out, oh, this is a Romero edited scene. His editing is so particular and so like unique to him. And that kind of goes with how he shoots things. A lot of the times, not always, I think especially when he's working really cheaply, Romero would just grab shots, as many shots as he could. Because when you're working really cheaply, that means shooting really fast. He would just grab shots, and then he would have to figure out how to put these things together in the edit. He didn't like have those things planned out in advance. And I think that forced him to get really creative in how he edited movies. And then using that forced creativity as like a proving ground, that just made him a really strong editor, even once he had more money and, you know, more resources, more time to plan out and later assemble things. I think you can say that about all of his movies, except for maybe his like last 2-ish movies. The editing is usually really standout. Romero has a really fun cameo role in Martin. He has cameo roles in like a lot of his movies, actually. They're usually really tiny. He's also in Silence of the Lambs, if you didn't know, like extremely briefly, like a blink and you miss it kind of thing. He has like substantial bit of dialogue. He plays like a hippie priest guy. And Romero was like kind of a hippie-ish dude in real life. He's extremely progressive, and I actually really like that about his movies. That's one of the things that helps keep his movies timeless, is that he never fell into the like, oh, it was a different time kind of thing. His movies don't look bad in retrospect in a way that a lot of his contemporaries often did. Just seemed like a great guy. If you ever watch interviews with him, he just always seemed like happy, loved making movies. You know, I don't know. I like his spirit. Anyway, Martin is really good. I would go as high as A with it. I think it's great. It's worth checking out. It's one of his underseen ones. Okay, next up is Knightriders. And like, if Martin is under talked about, Knightriders is even more under talked about. I've never heard a single person talk about this one. It is a bizarre movie. It's almost strange to me that it doesn't get talked about just as like a curiosity piece, because the premise is like, what if Ren Fair Knights rode motorcycles? That's basically the premise of the movie. Also, it's worth noting that this movie is called Knightriders, and it came out 1 year before the Knight Rider TV show. Spelled the same way and everything, except they spaced out Knight Rider. This is Knightriders, one word. But otherwise, you know, spelled the same, so the KN. And they have nothing to do with each other. It's not like, this is nothing like the Knight Rider TV show. It's not like this is a movie that got adapted into the TV show or anything. It just happened to have very similar title and only be 1 year apart. This is from, I think, 81, maybe even 82. I think 81. But it feels so 70s. I'm sure it like was conceived in the 70s. It's like the most 70s movie made in the 80s. It's also like feels a little bit 60s too, because it's very much in the like Easy Rider spirit, and not just because of the motorcycles, but also because of the like the counterculture streak that is just like coursing through its veins. This sort of like anti-establishment, anti-capitalist energy, which is, you know, an energy that I love personally. And this movie explores it really well. It's such a goofy premise, but if you buy into the premise, like the movie does, the movie treats its ridiculous premise with a completely straight face. The premise of Ren Fair Knights riding motorcycles is not played for laughs. It's not goofy in the movie's reality. It is of the utmost seriousness. It's super serious. Their Renaissance, like LARPing battles are not goofy. They're not played for laughs. They're played like climactic, monumental battles between warriors on the battlefield, you know? Even though they explain that like some of them are wearing like tinfoil armor and they're carrying weapons that are like cardboard, and they obliterate when they swing with the weapons and stuff. Like, that's part of the story, but they take it as seriously as you possibly could. And it's not just the movie taking it seriously, it's the characters. The characters who are in this Renaissance troupe, they're like a traveling band of entertainers. They move from place to place. But it's not set in like the Middle Ages or whatever. It's not like there's a time travel thing where they just have motorcycles in the Middle Ages. It's the modern day for when the movie was made. But the characters are all thoroughly committed to, they're like the most intense LARPers ever. They're fully committed to, like within the bounds of reason, behaving as if they are abiding by like a knight's code of honor, and like they're in Camelot or whatever. It's interesting. You have to buy the premise like the characters do, but the way that the characters buy so fully into it, and like the performances, like Ed Harris is the main character. This was one of his very first starring roles. He just happened to be a where's Romero from? Detroit, right? He happened to be from Detroit, where Romero's from. And he's the star of this, and then he obviously exploded later on and became a big star. In Ed Harris's performance, he's so committed. You know, he's not like playing it with a wink and a smile. You know, he's playing it like this is heavy drama. His character fully believes everything he stands for. And that character stands for some really far-fetched, idealistic, kind of hard to buy kind of things, morals, stances on like society. This is such a bizarre movie. It has so much more to say, and it's a lot more thought-provoking if you buy into the premise and you give it the runway that it's asking for. It's a long movie, by the way. It's 2.5 hours, which is crazy for a movie about Ren Fair dudes on like motorcycles or dirt bikes or whatever. It's longer than it needs to be. I will say the length is a problem. It kind of outstays its welcome a little bit, but I think it's really good, and I think it has things to say, a lot of things to say. Could they be said more clearly and more concisely? Absolutely. I do think it's really good. It's worth rediscovery. I'm going to give it another B. Okay, next up is Monkey Shines. This one I just watched for the tier list. I always kind of avoided it because, in general, I'm not a fan of the like killer animal subgenre of horror, which there are a lot of movies. Like, I'm not interested in like Anaconda and like all the killer alligator movies and stuff like that. They just they don't do it for me usually. So I figured this one wouldn't be for me. But goddamn it, did Romero make me invested in this subgenre? He really did. Monkey Shines, I liked it way more than I expected to. It's really impressive what they were able to pull off using a real trained monkey who was not harmed in the movie, by the way. They're very careful about that. I'm going to say the performance from this monkey, whose name was Boo, I think, the real monkey. The movie monkey is Ella. The performance from this little chimp is goddamn good. It's a genuine performance, not just like physical. Like the monkey gets so many close-ups where you can like, okay, it's cool the shot effect or whatever, but like you can see the thought process of the monkey. The things that they got this monkey to do are incredible. Like it just really shows how smart these monkeys are, and it helps you buy the premise of, which by the way the story is, there's a guy who becomes quadriplegic and he gets this monkey it's like a helper monkey, helps him do daily chores. The monkey will like bring him a drink of water, for example, or the monkey will like turn the radio on for him, stuff like that, and in return he will reward the monkey. And the movie goes to great lengths to make you believe not just that the monkey is capable of doing all these things, because that's plain to see, you're seeing it happen, but beyond that it's going to great lengths to demonstrate the bond between these two. You feel like a real love between man and monkey here, and that's really important for the later stages of the movie once it becomes a killer monkey movie. And I will say it's a believable shift. Now there is an unbelievable aspect to it, which there's like this psychic link thing going on. That's far-fetched for sure, and they don't really like make any attempt to explain it. You just have to accept that that's going on. The shines of the title is like shines, like The Shining, the way that's like the telepathic kind of thing. That's what that is. I don't know why the poster always has like a mechanical monkey on it. There's this poster with like the symbols, and then there's another one with the same mechanical monkey that's holding a bloody razor blade. It's not a mechanical monkey in the movie. It's a real monkey 100% of the time. It's not like a cursed mechanical monkey, which the poster might make you think. I thought the performances were good and the characters were believable. It's the only movie I know of where a quadriplegic man engages in a face-sitting sex scene, so it's unique in more ways than one. It's not like super gory or anything, but it is effectively tense in the right areas. I think the performances are pretty solid across the board. The main guy, there were a couple moments where I stopped believing him a little bit, where it's pretty much when he needs to be like really angry and furious. He starts feeling a little phony. And at first it was bothering me, and then I realized, oh, it's actually because he's not in control of his anger. It's the monkey's anger, because they're like linked in that way. It's the monkey's anger is coming out of him in a way that he's not in control of. And I think that does kind of justify the weirdness of the performance, though it might still take you out of the movie, and that would be fair, I think. Anyway, Monkey Shines, again, kind of like Knightriders, it's longer than it needs to be. It's like over 2 hours long, which is just a little too much for a killer monkey movie. But I think it's really good. I think it's another B. Okay, next up is Land of the Dead. This was Romero's long-awaited return to the zombie genre. He made Night of the Living Dead in the 60s, Dawn of the Dead in the 70s, Day of the Dead in the 80s. He basically did one a decade. Then he stepped away for a long time, and he came back in the 2000s. So there was a gap there. Came back in the 2000s with Land of the Dead, and then after Land of the Dead, he spent the rest of his career making more zombie movies pretty quickly. He stopped taking his time between them. Like, I think there's only 2 years between Land of the Dead and Diary of the Dead, and then another 2 years before Survival of the Dead. Land of the Dead also feels separate from that first trilogy of movies. Those first 3 feel linked in a way that the other ones don't. But I will say, Land of the Dead, I like more than a lot of people do. I don't think it's terrible. It's not anywhere near the quality of those first 3, but I don't think it's bad at all. I think I would give it a C tier still. I think there's enjoyable stuff in it. I think Dennis Hopper is a lot of fun. I like the development of the sort of like increasing intelligence of the zombies, right? Like we started getting into that in Day of the Dead with Bub. Bub was like the smart zombie. Now there's like one particularly smart zombie, like they learn to use tools and stuff, but then he's kind of like leading an army of smart zombies. It's a little more over the top, sure, but I think it's interesting and it makes sense. It feels like the logical next step in the zombie apocalypse, which is what the series is it's like we're checking in on the same zombie apocalypse further down the line each time is how I kind of like look at it, because it's a series they don't really share in the same characters, but they do share like a progression in the world and a progression in the way that the zombies behave, really. And then again, after Land of the Dead, that kind of gets dropped. Like Diary of the Dead and Survival of the Dead, that's kind of gone at that point. But we'll get to those movies later. Land of the Dead I think is still pretty good. The idea of this, I forgot the name of it, but there's like the big tower where everyone lives and it's like safe and it's like dystopian. It's like the rich people are up top and they got all the fancy stuff and then it's squalor around the outside. It's pretty tropish, let's be real. I do think it's executed decently. It's okay. It's not the best. But if we're comparing it to Romero's best zombie movies, it looks pretty bad in comparison. If we're comparing it to like zombie movies in general, it's a pretty enjoyable zombie movie. I've enjoyed it. I've seen it multiple times. I've enjoyed it every time. And I can watch it again now, Okay, Diary of the Dead was his next zombie movie after Land of the Dead. He stopped taking like a decade to conceive each zombie movie and he started just kind of pumping them out. I think it was like a funding thing. It was like he'd only get zombie movies made at this point. Romero never really got like the mainstream success he deserved. His movies would find some commercial success, but it was like he would always get looked down on as a horror filmmaker, and he could never get like the budgets he wanted and whatnot. Diary of the Dead is him playing around in the found footage genre, which is not my favorite genre of horror movie. I think there are a couple exceptions, but for the most part, the found footage horror genre is often used as like a gimmick to justify laziness or just like abundant cheapness. A lot, not always, of course, but Diary of the Dead feels extremely cheap. The acting is like unbelievably bad. I don't know why he would cast like half the people he cast in this. It's not good. I watched it once and I thought it was okay, and I rewatched it and I was like, oh, okay, it's not good. It's outright bad, I would say, actually. It's not good. It's not entirely without merit. It has a couple okay sequences. It's not believable in the slightest as a found footage movie. They do this stupid ass justification where one of the characters is acting like she found the camera with the footage that was left over, and she's editing it together in the memory of her like friends who died shooting the footage. And they've thrown this stupid bit where she talks about how she added in music to enhance certain moments, and it's like, fuck off. She would not. She's cobbling together the footage that her friend died shooting. She's not gonna put in scary music. Like, it's so dumb. As when just for the movie having like
tense music because it wasn't tense without the music, and they needed to figure out a way to justify there being scary music. It's not good. It's bad. I'd go E. I wouldn't quite go F with it. I do really like one moment where there's this Amish zombie killer guy. It's super over the top. I kind of like it in like a good bad way, not in like an actually good way. But they go to this mute Amish guy, and he's killing zombies with a scythe. He's like throwing dynamite and stuff. It's so ridiculous. And his death is so badass. He rams his scythe through his own head and kills a zombie behind him with it because the blade's long enough, you know? It's crazy. Anyway, movie, not great. But you know what is great? Dawn of the Dead, our next movie on here. If you watched my list of my top 100 horror movies of all time, then you know that Dawn of the Dead ranked extremely high on that list, like the very tippy top. I love this movie. I think it's a phenomenal piece of work all around. It gets the S tier easily. I think it's Romero's undisputed masterpiece. It's truly great. I think it's the best zombie movie ever made, and I think it's just genuinely one of the best horror movies ever made, and one of the best flat-out movies ever made. I think it's great. This movie is... it's so special to me. It's like a comfort movie in the way that people have like comfort movies, you know. It's long, but it's one of those movies where the length is totally justified and adds to the experience, I think. I think the long runtime helps this one, where it hinders Knightriders or even Monkey Shines a little bit, for example. I love these characters, these human characters. This movie, it isn't exactly an entry in the like hangout movie genre, like a Dazed and Confused kind of movie, but to me it has the effect of a hangout movie, where it's like you watch the movie when you just want to hang out with these characters for a little while. You know, like Roger and Peter and Flyboy, and they're just so much fun to be around. You love this little troop of survivors, and there's such a sense of fun coursing through this movie without ever losing sight of the horror and the tragedy and the sadness of it all. It covers the entire spectrum of human emotions. The music is great. There's two very different cuts of this movie. There's the Italian cut, which is like the more pure version, and then there's the US version, which like, the gore is actually mostly intact in the US version. I think there's like little differences. The biggest differences, to me, like the ones that are the most notable, are in the soundtrack. There's way more Goblin music in the Italian version, because Goblin's an Italian band, of course, and they mostly scored Italian horror movies. There is still some Goblin music in the US soundtrack. And honestly, I like the US soundtrack a lot too. I don't think it's necessarily inferior. Like, so replacing the Goblin music is like stock library music, but I actually think it's really well used, and I think it's still really enjoyable. I actually like both versions of the soundtrack, and I think they're both good. Both versions are worth watching, is what I would say. They're not like that different, but they are different enough to be worth watching both. Just space out your viewings a little bit. I just love this movie. I love every second of it. I love its progression. Like, I love that we watch this whole drawn out journey of them getting to the mall. It's not just set in the mall. It's, we see Roger and Peter as they're like these soldier guys storming the tenement building and fighting zombies there, and then they like desert, and they get the helicopter with the people from the news crew, you know, and they team up, and then they go to the mall. And I love the bikers come in, and Tom Savini's one of the bikers. Oh, I didn't mention Knightriders. Tom Savini is in Knightriders as an actor, and it's not like his role in Dawn of the Dead where it's like a fun cameo. He's like one of the main characters of Knightriders. I would say after Ed Harris, he's the main character, and he's really good. He shows a lot of emotional range that he doesn't really get the chance to show in his other roles, which are mostly just like, hey, it's a special effects guy in a little cameo role, and he's always fun. It's always great to see him. Knightriders gives him like a real dramatic character to chew on and to work with and shape. Anyway, again, like I said about Night of the Living Dead, I could talk about Dawn of the Dead all fucking day. It gets the S tier. Okay, Season of the Witch. This again is one of his lesser talked about movies. It's also kind of just like overlooked. I don't think Romero was too hot on this one the way that it turned out. I don't think quite as extreme as like There's Always Vanilla. Like, he fully disowned that one. I don't know if he completely disowned Season of the Witch, but it's a clear-cut case of like not having enough money, and the movie just does not turn out very well. It does have like one interesting thing to say, and to its credit, it effectively communicates that one thing that it has to say in a visual way, in like a visual symbolism, very on-the-nose symbolism, but symbolism nonetheless. It communicates that effectively visually in the opening, like 5 minutes, pretty much in the opening credits. But then it has nothing else to say the entire rest of the movie. It says its thing, and that thing is like, okay, it's pretty simple, but it works. And then it proceeds to just kill time until the movie ends. Honestly, the ending of the movie, I won't spoil it, I guess, but like the last scene of the movie feels like it should be the inciting incident. Like what we call in screenwriting the inciting incident, the thing that really sets the plot in motion, which you would want to have like 15 minutes in, even 10 minutes in maybe. That's the last scene of this movie. What should happen is you take that scene and you put that way at the beginning, and then the movie goes on from there. Instead, it's like they only had that scene, and they just are literally killing time to get to that. It's not great. Romero's editing is, I would say, interesting again here, but it's not his best editing. I would say his editing is more distracting than anything here in the normal scenes, but it is still really compelling in a way. So I wouldn't really call it bad. It's messier. The editing makes things surreal where they don't necessarily need to be surreal, and I think that's interesting. The surrealism is where Romero's direction shines, but it's only like little bursts, and then it's let down by the budget. Like she's always having these like nightmares or visions or whatever of this guy in a mask coming after her, but it's like the goofiest looking mask, and the guy is just some like lanky like dude. He's not threatening in the slightest. It's the attempts at like it being scary fall 100% flat. There's a lot of like, not exactly match cuts, but cuts where we're jumping from a location at one point in time to that same location with the same character at a much later point in time. And it's almost like a jump cut, but Romero's very purposefully doing it in a way to disorient you. Like we'll be in the living room, right? And we'll be watching the main housewife sitting in a chair, right? And then the audio will stay the same. It'll like blend together. And we'll hear like a door opening, and then we'll cut to show the door. And it's her coming through the door, and now it's her husband in the chair. Stuff like that. And it's like, okay, it's like a different day. We jumped forward in time here. It's really interestingly cut together in that way. But it's a messy movie. It's really rough around the edges. I don't really recommend it at all. Oh, the title, by the way. Season of the Witch is the title on this poster, and one of the titles it's known by, but it's also known by the title Hungry Wives. It's like an alternate title for it. Just because you might have heard it by that too. I think it's even called Hungry Wives on Letterboxd instead of Season of the Witch. Season of the Witch, the title actually comes from, well, there's like witchy stuff in it, but it comes from the Donovan song, Season of the Witch, which I didn't know until I put on the movie and I saw in the credits, Season of the Witch performed by Donovan. I was like, oh, what the fuck? I didn't realize there was a connection. I knew he had a song called Season of the Witch. Obviously, it's one of his most famous songs. I'm actually a really big Donovan fan, which might surprise you. I like his music a whole lot. Now, he didn't write the song for this movie. The song was on an album like 4 years before the movie came out. But that song is in the movie, and it's played in its entirety. There's basically like a sequence towards the middle of the movie where they play the entire song, and then that's where it takes its title. I don't know necessarily that the song is all that well utilized. It's kind of just played over a scene that would be extremely boring otherwise, where we're just watching the main character look around a shop for way longer than we need to. It's kind of like we're only watching her do this for so long because they want to play the whole song before the dialogue happens with the cashier guy. It's pretty transparent. It's not a good movie. I'd say E tier again. Okay, next up is Day of the Dead. This was his third zombie movie. This was his 80s contribution to the Dead series. It's great. I'd say it's a little bit of a step down from Dawn of the Dead, but it is a step up from Night of the Living Dead. It's almost as good as Dawn of the Dead. I'm going to put it in the A tier. The first time I watched it, I didn't like it all that much. But then I watched it again, and I was like, okay, this is actually really good. Every time I've watched this, which I've probably watched this movie 6, 7 times, every time I watch it, I like it more and more and more, and I absolutely love this movie now. There's so much to love about this movie. I really love the characters, again, the human characters. Also Bub, the zombie character. But the Dr. Frankenstein character is a lot of fun. Captain Rhodes is like iconic. I love that guy. Joe Polito. This guy yells like a motherfucker, you know. His screaming and swearing, his death scene is amazing. He's got one of the best zombie deaths ever, like death by zombie, I mean. Well, maybe the best one, honestly. The gore in this one is so good. It's Tom Savini again, who did Dawn of the Dead as well. Dawn of the Dead pioneered a lot of new special effects techniques. Day of the Dead like perfected zombie gore. The blood looks way more real. Savini didn't really like the blood in Dawn of the Dead. It looked it's too like bright and cartoonish. Romero liked it because it looked, he thought it looked like a comic book, and he liked that about it. Savini didn't like it because it didn't look real. Savini, if you didn't know, his background in special effects comes from being a war photographer and photographing like real wounds, and with makeup he's trying to make wounds look as real as possible. He's seen death firsthand, like dead soldiers, He was trying to recreate that makeup wise. Dawn of the Dead I think is like the pinnacle of what Savini achieved special effects wise, and he achieved a lot special effects wise throughout his career. He's one of the masters of that medium. The Dawn of the Dead gore effects are so good. I would say it's not like packed with them. It's kind of like there's some right at the start, and then there's a lot at the end. And then in the middle, there's only like little bits here and there. Like there's a bit where like a zombie sits up on a tree and all its guts spill out. It looks so good. Stuff like that throughout. A lot of this movie, and this is why I can get why some people don't like it and why I didn't like it so much the first time I saw it. It's very talky in the middle. At this point in our group of survivors, there's the military and there's the scientists. And there's a very clear divide between the two, between the like rational and irrational, between the intellectual and the like brute force. And again, Romero's doing a lot with social commentary there. A lot that is obvious and a lot that's more subtle. And even the obvious stuff is still incisive and really well communicated, really well woven into the story. And the story and the characters are what really grow on me the most every time I watch this. The talky bits that, rubbed a lot of people the wrong way if you go back and like read, reviews of the time and whatnot. A lot of people just thought this one was boring. I don't think it's boring at all. After, by the second watch, I was like, oh, it's not boring. It's actually like fascinating. There's a lot of really interesting things going on in this section of the movie. A lot of interesting ideas and phenomenal world building, especially when you consider that it mostly just takes place in these underground salt mines, which in real life were like used to store film negatives. Considering most of the movie is like confined to this location, there's such great world building being done, and a lot of that is accomplished in the like prologue of the movie, which, as brief as it is one of my favorite depictions of an apocalyptic city. It's very brief, but it's like every shot communicates so much about the state of the world. I think it's really powerful, and it's like the economy of shots, right? In just this many shots, Romero paints such a clear picture of the complete return to nature that civilization has seen, with like the palm tree leaves littering the streets, with the zombies overrunning, everywhere, with the alligator on the town hall steps or the bank steps or whatever. It's such a great shot. Again, I could talk about this movie forever. I love it. I think it's wonderful. I think it's another masterpiece. I could even almost go S with it, but just the extent that I love Dawn of the Dead makes me want to put it on its own little pedestal. So I'm gonna keep Day of the Dead in A, which is like, it's great. Okay, next up is Survival of the Dead. This was Romero's last movie. It was another of the Dead movie, and just like Diary of the Dead, it shouldn't really be considered part of the same series. I really don't consider it the same series. For me, I think of the first three movies, and then Land of the Dead is like the little epilogue add-on that's like kind of canon, kind of not, right? I don't consider Diary of the Dead or Survival of the Dead canon whatsoever. So I watched Diary of the Dead, and I was like, okay, it's okay. And I watched Survival of the Dead and hated it. I watched Diary of the Dead again, and I was like, okay, I kind of hate this one now too. And I did not watch Survival of the Dead again. I have not rewatched this one. I hated it. I liked it even less than Diary of the Dead the first time through. I won't give it an F, just to be fair to it, because I haven't seen it in a long time. So there's a chance maybe I would like it a little more. I don't know. And I remember it being like super poorly made or anything, but I just feel like, I don't know. These last two zombie movies, Romero, I feel like he shouldn't have put his name on those, I feel like they almost kind of hurt his legacy a little bit. They're not good. They feel generic. They feel like rip-offs of his own earlier zombie movies. They don't feel like Romero movies. I feel like they weren't made for the right reasons either, which is a shame. But anyway, moving on. Next up is The Amusement Park. This movie was a lost film for many, many years. It was made really early on in Romero's career, after Night of the Living Dead, but before most of his other movies. I think even after The Crazies, but before Martin. like in between those two, I think is where he made it. I might not be exactly right. But he was originally hired to make a PSA on, I think, elder abuse was the subject. He got hired by the Lutheran Society, I think it was. So the Lutheran Society contacts George A. Romero. I think it's because he was a local filmmaker, not because they were like fans of him. And they go, can you make a PSA for us on elder abuse? And Romero goes, if you're paying me, sure. And what he does is he takes their money and it is a PSA on elder abuse, but then it spirals out of control into like a full-fledged, I don't know if I'd say fully fledged horror movie, but a full-fledged satire with horror elements. It's one of his most experimental movies. It has experimental editing in the way that movies like Martin and Season of the Witch have. And then it also has some experimental storytelling elements where there's like recursion. You see the same old man enter a room and talk to himself. I actually reviewed this movie already. I covered this in last year's Macabre Month of Horror in its own dedicated review, so you can go check that out. Because the story behind it is that it was lost for years. It was like a lost movie. Someone uncovered an old negative of it, and they restored it, and it became a Shudder exclusive, and it was released to the world, a brand new George A. Romero movie after he had passed away several years earlier. So it was a real treat for us Romero fans, for horror fans. I would give it a C, because it doesn't like fully escape its trappings as being made as a PSA. It's also like an hour long. It's not quite a feature film, but it's definitely worth watching for Romero fans. And lastly, we have Creepshow. Creepshow is probably one of his highest budgeted, like most polished movies, one of those like kind of mainstream movies. It's written by Stephen King, meaning he wrote the screenplay, not just like the source material. It's actually not really pulling from as much source material. It's an ode to the like EC horror comics. It's an anthology movie. It's actually one of the few anthology movies where the trend kind of became with anthology movies that a different horror director would do each segment. And Romero's involved in a couple other of those. Like he directed a segment in a movie called Two Evil Eyes. I didn't cover that one because he only did like one part of it. He directed all of the segments in Creepshow, which there's 5 stories, 5 main vignettes, and then like a wraparound sequence. And the wraparound sequence has Tom Atkins in it, so you know it's good, because that guy's always good. Out of the 5 segments, I would say 4 of them are good, and I would say maybe 3 of them are great. Just to quickly cover each vignette, the birthday one, I think is entertaining. It's got Ed Harris again, still before he was like famous. That one's fun. It's got a great looking zombie, but beyond that, I don't know, there's not too much going on. The Comet, Jordy Verrill, the Stephen King performance. It's Stephen King in full dope mode. he's this dopey ass farmer, and I love it. I love this performance from him, and it's so over the top and so funny. It kind of feels like he's doing the same shtick in Knightriders actually when he has this cameo in that movie. Like, he's like super dopey in that one too, and he's super dopey in his cameo in Maximum Overdrive, which he directed, and which I have a video for that you should check out on this channel. I made a Maximum Overdrive Deserves More Respect is the name of that video, because I love Maximum Overdrive. That movie is like notoriously hated by everybody, but I love it. The Comet one is really funny. I'd say it's mostly the comedy that you get out of that one. Creepshow in general, like the feature around it is very funny, as well as being an effective horror movie. I think my favorite is the one with Leslie Nielsen. It's also the one that has Ted Danson in it too. He's burying a guy up to his neck in the sand. Actually, 2 people up to their necks in sand and letting the tide come in and kill them. That's so much fun. I like that one a lot. The one with the crate and the monster in the crate, that one's a lot of fun too. I don't like the cockroach one because it's just cockroaches. It's just gross, and that's the full extent of it. There's nothing to it. There's no substance. There's no like enjoyment value. So I don't like that one. But overall package, enjoyable. I think Creepshow's really great. I think it's probably another B. If it didn't have the cockroach one, or rather if that segment was elevated with something, I'd probably give Creepshow an A, the overall package. That one brings it down a notch. Just that one story is the weak link. The rest of the film I highly recommend. So here is Romero's filmography. He's got quite a spread, meaning quite a lot of variance in his career, but overall, really solid filmmaker. He's got the most Bs, and remember, Bs are like really solid. A B is like a great movie, like an 8 out of 10 kind of movie. This one's not horror, by the way. I didn't mention, if that's not apparent. It's kind of hard to classify. You almost want to call it a fantasy movie, but it's just because of the knights and stuff, but there is no like magic or fantasy element. They're just people who act like knights. There aren't any knights. They're in modern day, you know, they're on motorcycles. So I guess you just call it like a drama with some action elements. So it's a very left field movie for Romero. Strong body of work. I love Romero. I love his spirit and what he stood for and the things he chose to say in his movies and with his movies, the stances he took against the norm. I think that's all really important stuff. And he really is one of the masters of horror. I think he's truly deserving of that title. Thanks for watching. Check out some of the other videos in this year's Macabre Month of Horror. The playlist will be on screen right now, as will be the playlists for past year's Macabre Months of Horror. Remember, you can check out my horror novel, South of the Mason-Dixon, if you want to see my spin on the horror genre, my take on religious terror and cult terror and things of that nature. Lots of violence and all kinds of stuff like that. Thanks for watching. So long.